The snow fell in thick, soundless sheets, blanketing the world in a pristine silence. Clara adjusted her scarf, pulling it tighter around her neck as she trudged through the empty streets of Black Hollow, a small town that seemed forgotten by time and warmth. She had been called back to settle her late aunt's affairs, a woman she hadn't seen in years, but remembered vividly for her peculiar stories and secretive nature. The house stood at the edge of the woods, by its dark silhouette looming against the pale backdrop of snow. Clara hesitated on the front step, the key cold and heavy in her gloved hand. The stories about this house had always seemed exaggerated. Doors opening by themselves, cold drafts even in the summer, and the constant feeling of being watched. But as she pushed the door open, she couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her nose wrinkle. The old radiator groaned as she turned it on, barely offering warmth. Clara moved through the house, her boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. Everything was as her aunt had left it. Dusty furniture, curtains drawn tight, and a single half-melted candle on the dining table. As night fell, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Clara sat by the flickering light of the candle, sorting through stacks of her aunt's papers. Among the bills and letters was a handwritten journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Flipping it open, she found entries about strange occurrences, whispers in the middle of the night, shadows moving where none should exist, and a warning never to stay in the house after midnight. Superstitious nonsense, Clara muttered, though her hands trembled as she turned the pages. A loud thump came from upstairs, breaking the oppressive silence. Clara froze, her breath clouding in the icy air. It could be the old house settling, she reasoned, but the sound came again, deliberate, heavier. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet amplifying her anxiety. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness. The beam of her flashlight quivered as she scanned the doors. They were all closed, except for one at the far end, the attic. She hadn't even realized the house had an attic. The door stood ajar, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into blackness. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, just the oppressive quiet and the muffled sound of the wind outside. Summoning her courage, Clara climbed the stairs. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and broken lamps. The flashlight caught something on the floor, a trail of wet footprints leading from the window to the center of the room. Clara's heart pounded as she followed the trail, stopping when she reached a rocking chair facing away from her. It rocked gently, though there was no draft to move it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The chair stopped. Before Clara could react, a low, guttural whisper filled the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You shouldn't have come back." The flashlight flickered, and in that momentary darkness, Clara felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. She screamed, dropping the light, its beam now casting erratic shadows across the room. The window slammed shut behind her, and the footprints on the floor began to spread, forming a dark, oozing stain that crept toward her. She backed away, stumbling over a box, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an incomprehensible cacophony. Suddenly, the attic door slammed open and the noises stopped. Clara scrambled to her feet and bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back. The house groaned as if alive, its walls seeming to close in on her. She grabbed her coat and keys, flinging the front door open and racing out into the snow. The cold air burned her lungs, but she didn't stop running until she reached her car. As she fumbled with the keys, she glanced back at the house. Through the attic window, a figure stood silhouetted against the faint light, a tall, shadowy shape with glowing, hollow eyes. Clara drove away without looking back, the image of that figure seared into her mind. She never returned to Black Hollow, leaving the house and whatever haunted it to its eerie solitude. But sometimes on cold, silent nights, she swore she could hear the whispers, carried on the winter wind, calling her back.
Story number 2.
The wind clawed at the old cabin, howling like a feral beast. Marcus hunched by the fire, feeding it logs as the storm raged outside. He'd been told this mountain was treacherous in winter, but he hadn't expected the storm to roll in so suddenly. The isolation didn't bother him. He'd come here for solitude. But tonight, something felt off. The cabin was sturdy, built by his grandfather decades ago, its walls lined with family relics and faded photographs. He had fond childhood memories here, but the place felt different now. The air was heavy, charged with something he couldn't name. As he sipped his coffee, a sound broke through the wail of the storm, a sharp, insistent knocking. Marcus froze. Who would be out in this weather? He approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" he called, his voice muffled by the wind. The knocking stopped. Marcus stood there, his breath visible in the cold air. Then the knocking resumed, louder this time. "Who's there?" he demanded. No answer. Grabbing the hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, he opened the door just enough to peer outside. Snow whipped through the gap, stinging his face. The porch was empty. No footprints. Nothing but the undisturbed snow. His chest tightened as he closed and bolted the door. He told himself it was the wind, some branch knocking against the cabin. But deep down, he knew better. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of easing. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Just as Marcus began to relax, he heard it again. Not a knock this time, but a soft, deliberate scratching. It came from the window behind him. His blood ran cold as he turned slowly. The curtains were drawn, but the scratching continued, steady and methodical. Summoning his courage, Marcus yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. The window revealed only the swirling snow. But before he could let out a breath, a pale hand slapped against the glass. Marcus stumbled back, his heart hammering. The hand was impossibly long, its fingers ending in jagged nails. It lingered for a moment before dragging slowly down the glass, leaving streaks in the frost. He aimed the rifle at the window, his hands shaking. "Get away!" he shouted. The hand disappeared. For a moment there was silence. Then the roof groaned above him, as if something heavy was moving across it. Marcus backed toward the center of the room, his eyes darting to the ceiling. The sound stopped directly above him. The fire flickered violently, casting the room into near darkness. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the trapdoor leading to the attic. It was bolted shut, but the handle quivered as though something on the other side was trying to lift it. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the cabin. Marcus froze, his mind racing. There was no animal that could make that sound. The trapdoor suddenly burst open, the bolt snapping like a twig. Marcus barely had time to react before the flashlight beam caught it, a grotesque figure crawling out of the attic. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending the wrong way. Its face was a twisted mockery of human features, with hollow, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Marcus fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space. The creature recoiled, letting out an unearthly screech. But it didn't stop. It lunged at him, faster than anything that size should move. He threw himself to the side, the creature crashing into the wall. Marcus scrambled to his feet, grabbing a burning log from the fireplace. He swung it wildly, the flames catching the creature's flesh. It let out a horrifying wail, retreating into the shadows. Marcus didn't wait to see if it would come back. He grabbed his keys and ran for the door, flinging it open. The storm blinded him, but he didn't care. He ran into the snow, the cabin receding into the darkness behind him. As he reached his truck, he glanced back one last time. The cabin stood silent, its windows dark. But in the doorway, the creature stood watching him, its glowing eyes piercing through the storm. Marcus didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town. He told himself he'd imagined that the storm had played tricks on his mind. But even now, in the safety of his home, he sometimes hears the scratching at his window on cold, stormy nights.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm came suddenly, trapping Olivia and her 4 friends in the abandoned lodge they'd stumbled across on their winter hike. It wasn't marked on any maps, but with night falling fast and the freezing temperatures cutting through their gear, they had little choice but to take shelter. The lodge was old, its walls warped by time and neglect. Dust coated every surface, and the windows were cracked and smeared with grime. Yet the fireplace worked, and the group was grateful for the small bubble of warmth it provided. They huddled around it, laughing nervously and trying to shake the unease that hung in the air. "Ever notice how places like this always have some creepy backstory?" joked Evan, the group's usual skeptic. "I'm not in the mood for ghost stories," Olivia replied, staring at the dancing flames. But Lily, the thrill-seeker, grinned and leaned in. "I heard about a lodge like this. Supposedly, a family froze to death inside during a freak storm. People say their spirits still linger, looking for warmth. Thanks for that, Olivia muttered. The night wore on, and the wind outside howled with ferocity. One by one, the group began to drift off to sleep, wrapped in their sleeping bags around the fire. Olivia stayed awake, her mind racing. Something about the lodge felt wrong, too quiet, too forgotten. A faint noise caught her attention. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. It came from the hallway leading to the back of the lodge. Her heart raced. She sat up, scanning the room. Everyone else was fast asleep. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The noise stopped. Minutes passed in silence. Just as she was beginning to convince herself it was nothing, the sound resumed, closer this time. She grabbed a flashlight and stood, every instinct telling her to wake the others. But something compelled her to go alone. The beam of light cut through the darkness as she made her way toward the hallway. The air grew colder the farther she went, her breath visible in the dim glow of the flashlight. The sound led her to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, empty, except for a single rocking chair in the corner. It swayed gently, though there was no draft. Olivia stepped closer, her flashlight shaking. That's when she saw it. Faint handprints on the frost-covered window. They weren't human. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow. A shadow moved behind her in the reflection of the glass. She spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the room. Nothing. But the chair had stopped rocking. She backed out of the room, her chest tight with fear. As she turned to head back to the others, she heard something behind her. A whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. "Stay." Olivia ran. She burst back into the main room, her heart pounding. "Wake up," she yelled, shaking Evan. "What's wrong?" he asked groggily. "We have to leave. Now." Before anyone could respond, the fire sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. A deep, guttural groan echoed through the lodge, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The group scrambled to their feet, panicked. "What the hell was that?" Lily screamed. The footsteps grew louder, coming from all directions. Shadows began to shift unnaturally in the corners of the room, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. "We need to get out," Olivia yelled, grabbing her backpack. The door to the lodge slammed shut with a deafening bang. The windows frosted over instantly, trapping them in a cocoon of ice and darkness. Evan tried to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck!" The shadows converged, taking on a vaguely humanoid form. Hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and an overwhelming cold filled the room. "Leave," the entity hissed, its voice like the scraping of ice. "We're trying," Olivia shouted, pulling at the door with all her strength. The creature reached out, its elongated fingers stretching toward them. Lily screamed as the temperature plummeted, frost creeping up their skin. Just as the shadows were about to engulf them, the door burst open and the wind roared in. The group didn't hesitate. They ran into the storm, the snow biting at their faces. When they finally reached the safety of their car, they looked back. The lodge was gone, replaced by an expanse of untouched snow. To this day, Olivia swears she can hear the faint whisper of that single word, "Stay," whenever the wind howls through the trees.
Story number 4.
The road was icy, the snowstorm growing more intense by the minute. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She had no choice but to keep going. The highway was deserted, a barren stretch of asphalt cutting through miles of dense, snow-covered forest. Her GPS had stopped working hours ago, leaving her with nothing but the faint glow of her headlights and the endless white beyond. The storm worsened, and visibility dropped to nearly zero. Just as panic began to set in, she spotted it, a small flickering light in the distance. A gas station. Relief washed over her as she pulled into the lot, her tires crunching over the snow. The station was ancient, its paint peeling and its sign barely legible. The single pump stood like a relic of another time, half buried in a snowdrift. The light came from inside the building, a dim bulb casting eerie shadows through the frosted windows. Rachel hesitated. The place looked abandoned, but she needed directions, or at least a place to wait out the storm. She stepped out of the car, the cold slicing through her jacket like a knife. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of old oil and mildew. The shelves were stocked with dusty cans and outdated snacks, as if no one had shopped here in years. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing unnervingly. No answer. She moved toward the counter, her boots squeaking on the linoleum. A single chair sat behind the register, its seat worn down to the stuffing. The light overhead flickered, casting her shadow long and distorted against the walls. That's when she saw it. A Polaroid photo taped to the counter. It was a picture of her car, parked outside the gas station. Rachel's blood ran cold. She glanced over her shoulder at the window. The storm obscured her view, but she could swear she saw movement outside, just a flicker of a shadow darting past. "Is someone here?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Another Polaroid lay on the floor, partially hidden under the counter. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was a picture of her, taken just moments ago, standing at the counter. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a camera or some explanation. But there was nothing, just the oppressive quiet and the dim hum of the light overhead. She backed toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. Just as her hand touched the doorknob, the bell jingled behind her. She froze. Slowly she turned around. A man stood in the doorway to the back room, his face obscured by the shadows. His clothes were filthy, his posture unnaturally rigid. He held another Polaroid in his hand. Rachel took a step back. What? What do you want?" The man didn't respond. He stepped forward and the light finally revealed his face. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. He raised the Polaroid and held it out to her. Her hands shook as she took it. This time the photo showed her car again, but now the driver's seat was empty. Without thinking, Rachel bolted for the door. She flung it open and ran to her car, her boots slipping on the ice. She fumbled with the keys and had her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she started the engine, she glanced back at the gas station. The man stood in the doorway, watching her, his grin stretching impossibly wide. She tore out of the lot, her tires skidding on the icy road. The storm swallowed her, the gas station disappearing into the white void. But as she drove, her heart still racing, she noticed something in the rearview mirror. Another Polaroid sat on the passenger seat, though she was certain it hadn't been there before. Her hands shook as she reached for it, her eyes darting between the road and the photograph. It was a picture of her, taken from the back seat. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she glanced in the rearview mirror again. A pair of eyes stared back at her, just inches away.
Story number 5.
The snow-covered fields stretched endlessly under the moonlight, a stark, lifeless expanse that seemed to absorb sound. Emily's boots crunched through the icy crust as she made her way toward the decrepit farmhouse at the edge of the woods. Her car had broken down miles back, and with no cell service, the house was her only chance to find help before the temperature dropped further. The farmhouse was old, its roof sagging and its windows cracked. A single light flickered inside, weak and yellow, as though struggling to stay alive. Emily knocked on the door, the sound echoing unnervingly in the still air. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The door creaked open on its own. She hesitated, peering into the dim interior. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint, sickly sweet odor that made her stomach churn. She stepped in, her boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. As the hallway stretched into darkness, the light coming from a room to the right. Emily moved cautiously, her breath fogging in the cold air. The room was sparsely furnished. A table, a single chair, and a dusty oil lamp casting its feeble glow. On the table lay a notebook, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Curiosity got the better of her. She flipped it open. The writing was frantic, scrawled in uneven lines that crisscrossed over one another. Words like watching, trapped, and don't let it see you jumped out at her, filling her with unease. A noise from upstairs made her freeze, a soft, deliberate creak like someone shifting their weight. "Hello," she called again, more forcefully this time. Silence. She told herself it was probably the house settling, but something felt wrong. She backed toward the door, intent on leaving. It slammed shut before she could reach it. Emily screamed, grabbing at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. The light from the lamp flickered, then extinguished, plunging her into darkness. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she fumbled for her flashlight. She managed to switch it on, the beam slicing through the blackness. That's when she saw it. A figure stood at the base of the staircase, barely visible in the weak light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated and spindly. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the dark. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight shaking. What are you? She stammered. The figure didn't move. It simply stared, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. Then, in a motion too fast for her to track, it disappeared. Her flashlight flickered. She swung it around wildly, the beam bouncing off the walls. The sound of creaking wood came from all directions now, as if the house itself was alive and closing in on her. Something brushed against her shoulder, cold and soft, like a breath. She spun around, but nothing was there. Panic overtook her. She bolted for the stairs, her only thought to get away, even if it meant going deeper into the house. She took the steps 2 at a time, her flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a long hallway lined with doors. All were closed except one at the far end, its frame shrouded in darkness. The creaking followed her, growing louder, closer. She ran toward the open door, slamming it shut behind her as she entered. The room was barren, except for a single mirror leaning against the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and trembling. But then, her reflection smiled. Emily froze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her own face twisted into a grin, teeth bared unnaturally as if mocking her fear. She turned away from the mirror, her chest heaving. The creaking stopped outside the door. The silence was worse. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening. There was nothing, no sound, no movement. Summoning her courage, she opened the door a crack and peeked out. The hallway was empty. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned back to the room, the mirror was no longer against the wall. It was now directly behind her. And her reflection wasn't alone. A figure loomed over her in the glass, its glowing eyes staring into hers. Before she could scream, the lights went out, and the last thing she felt was the cold, claw-like grip on her shoulder. When searchers found the farmhouse days later, it was empty. There were no footprints leading in or out, and no sign of Emily, only a dusty mirror lying shattered on the floor, with faint, bloody handprints smeared across its surface.
Story number 6.
The snow fell in heavy, suffocating sheets as Jake trudged up the narrow mountain path. The remote cabin he'd rented was still a mile away, but his car had skidded into a ditch, forcing him to continue on foot. The dense forest pressed in on both sides, the trees like skeletal sentinels in the fading light. It wasn't supposed to snow this much, the weather report had said. But weather reports didn't mean much this far into the wilderness. His breath came in short, visible puffs as he pushed forward, the weight of his backpack slowing him down. Then he saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just barely visible through the falling snow. It was tall and unmoving, its silhouette faint but unmistakable. "Hello?" Jake called, his voice muffled by the storm. No response. He squinted, but the snow blurred the figure's features. It stood in the middle of the path, blocking his way. "Do you need help?" he shouted, taking a step forward. The figure didn't move. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down his spine. He took another step, but when he glanced up again, the figure was gone. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Jake quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. The trees around him creaked and groaned under the weight of the snow, their branches swaying ominously. He reached the cabin just as darkness fell. It was small and unassuming, its porch covered in a thick layer of snow. He fumbled with the key the rental agency had sent him and stepped inside, grateful to escape the storm. The cabin was exactly as described, rustic, with a small wood-burning stove and a single bedroom. Jake wasted no time lighting the fire, his hands shaking as he stacked the logs. The warmth slowly seeped into the room, and he began to relax. But as he unpacked his gear, he noticed something odd. The window above the kitchen sink was open, snow blowing in. He didn't remember opening it. Shrugging it off as his own oversight, he closed and locked it. The wind rattled the glass, but the cabin felt secure. He cooked a simple meal, the sound of the storm outside making the cabin feel even cozier. He was just about to settle down with a book when he heard it, a soft tapping at the window. Jake froze. The sound was faint but deliberate, as though someone or something was knocking. He turned slowly toward the window. Through the frost-covered glass, he could just make out a hand. It was pale and thin, with unnaturally long fingers that tapped rhythmically against the pane. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, grabbing the fire poker from the hearth. The hand disappeared. Heart racing, he flung the door open and shone his flashlight into the night. The storm raged on, the snow covering everything in a thick, unbroken blanket. There were no footprints. Shaking, he locked the door and bolted it for good measure. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the light and the storm. But the tapping returned. This time, it came from the bedroom window. Jake's stomach dropped. He crept toward the room, his grip on the fire poker tightening. The window was frosted over, but he could see a faint outline on the other side. "Go away," he yelled, his voice cracking. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for the wind. Jake backed away from the window, his nerves frayed. Then he heard it, the creak of the floorboards behind him. He spun around, swinging the poker wildly, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The floorboards creaked again, this time closer. Jake's flashlight flickered, the beam casting wild shadows across the walls. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the light, something moved. It was the figure from the path, its tall, gaunt form looming in the shadows. Its face was obscured, but its glowing eyes bored into him, filled with an otherworldly malice. Jake stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a marionette being dragged by invisible strings. He turned and ran, his heart pounding as he bolted out the front door and into the storm. He didn't stop running, his boots slipping on the icy ground as the snow whipped around him. When he finally looked back, the cabin was gone, swallowed by the storm. But the figure stood at the edge of the tree line, watching him. Jake didn't stop until he reached the road. A passing truck driver found him hours later, half frozen and incoherent. He never went back for his car. The rental agency later claimed they had no record of a cabin at the coordinates he provided. To this day, Jake swears he can feel eyes watching him whenever snow begins to fall.
Story number 7.
The blizzard had turned the world into a suffocating void of white by the time Clara spotted the train station. She'd been driving home from her parents' cabin when her car skidded off the icy road, leaving her stranded miles from the nearest town. The station wasn't on her map, but the glowing sign above its entrance, Black Hollow Station, was a beacon of hope in the freezing night. Shivering, she hurried inside, grateful for the shelter. The interior was oddly pristine, as if frozen in time. Polished wooden benches lined the walls, and an old-fashioned ticket counter stood at the far end. A single clock hung above it, its hands frozen at midnight. "Hello?" Clara called, her voice echoing through the empty space. No one answered. The station seemed abandoned, but the faint hum of electricity suggested otherwise. She moved to the counter, scanning for any sign of life. That's when she noticed the schedule board. It listed destinations, but none she recognized. Eversleep Junction, Duskwood, the Silent Loop. Her unease deepened. The storm outside roared louder, the wind rattling the windows. Clara glanced back toward the door, but the snow had already piled high against it, trapping her inside. A faint chime echoed through the station, followed by a voice crackling over the intercom. "Attention, passengers. The midnight train will be arriving shortly. Please proceed to the platform." Clara froze. She was alone, wasn't she? Before she could process what she'd heard, the station lights flickered, then dimmed, leaving only a cold, bluish glow. A door to her right creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. Her instincts screamed to stay put, but curiosity or desperation pushed her forward. She descended cautiously, her footsteps echoing with each step. At the bottom was the platform, shrouded in an eerie mist. The air was colder here, biting into her skin. The tracks were lined with flickering gas lamps, their flames barely holding steady against the encroaching dark. She wasn't alone. Figures stood on the platform, their backs to her. They were dressed in outdated clothing, long coats, bowler hats, flowing dresses, and stood unnaturally still like mannequins. "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Does anyone know when the train gets here?" The figures didn't respond. The sound of a distant whistle broke the silence. Clara turned toward the tracks, her heart pounding. A train emerged from the mist, its headlights piercing the darkness. It was an old steam engine, its exterior glistening with frost. It screeched to a halt, and the doors hissed open. "Boarding now," the intercom crackled. Clara looked back at the figures. They began to move, stiffly at first, like puppets being guided by unseen strings. They shuffled toward the train, their faces still hidden. "Wait!" Clara called, panic rising in her chest. "Where is this train going?" One of the figures turned to her. Its face was wrong, its features blurred and indistinct, like a smudged painting. Its hollow eyes seemed to see straight through her. "Home," it whispered, its voice like the wind slipping through cracks in a door. Clara stepped back, her body trembling with fear. The other figures turned as well, their blurred faces identical, their lifeless eyes fixed on her. "Come with us," they said in unison, their voices overlapping in an unnatural harmony. Clara shook her head, backing away toward the stairs. No, I'm not getting on that train." The figures began to advance, their movements unnervingly smooth now. The train's whistle blew again, louder and more urgent. The air grew heavy, pressing against Clara's chest. The shadows on the platform twisted and lengthened, reaching for her. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on the icy floor. She stumbled up the stairs, the sound of the figure's pursuit growing louder behind her. Bursting back into the station, she slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for air. The silence was deafening. When she finally dared to look around, the station was empty. The storm outside had stopped, and the windows revealed a clear, moonlit night. The clock above the counter ticked softly, its hands moving again. Clara fled the station, not stopping until she reached the road. A passing snowplow picked her up hours later, and she told the driver about the train station. He gave her a puzzled look. "There's no station out here," he said. "Never has been." Years later, Clara heard rumors about Black Hollow Station. A phantom train, they said, that takes lost souls to a place beyond the living. She never traveled alone at night again.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm had swallowed the entire town, leaving every street and house buried in a heavy, suffocating silence. Laura was alone in her childhood home, spending the weekend to sort through her late parents' belongings. It was supposed to be a cathartic trip, a chance to find closure. But now, trapped by the blizzard, it felt like the house was closing in around her. The electricity had gone out an hour ago, leaving her with only the light of a few flickering candles. The shadows danced on the walls, growing long and distorted. She wrapped a blanket tighter around herself as the wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. She was sorting through a box of her parents' old photographs when she found something peculiar, a small, unmarked envelope tucked beneath a stack of faded Polaroids. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph, its edges curled with age. It showed a group of people standing in front of the house, but something about the photo made her uneasy. In the background, in an upstairs window, a figure was staring out, a tall, dark silhouette with unnaturally long arms. Laura frowned. The figure looked out of place, like it had been crudely added to the image. She flipped the photo over, but there was no date or writing to explain it. A creak from upstairs made her jump, the sound echoing through the quiet house. She froze, her heart pounding. The upstairs had been empty earlier. She hadn't even gone up there. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence. Gripping the flashlight she'd been using earlier, she made her way to the staircase. The beam wavered as she climbed, her breath shallow and quick. The upstairs hallway was just as she remembered it. Narrow, lined with closed doors, the floorboards warped from years of wear. She checked each room, her nerves fraying with every creak and groan of the old house. Bedroom, empty. Bathroom, empty. At the end of the hall was her parents' room, the door slightly ajar. "Hello?" she called again, pushing the door open. The room was empty, the faint scent of her mother's old perfume lingering in the air. She let out a shaky breath and turned to leave. That's when she saw it. The closet door, which she had left closed earlier, was now wide open. Her flashlight flickered, the beam casting shadows that seemed to shift and move. She approached the closet cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to run. Inside, the closet was empty, except for a single photograph lying on the floor. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was another picture of the house, but this time the figure was standing on the lawn, closer to the camera. Her blood ran cold. A loud crash from downstairs sent her spinning around. It sounded like the front door slamming open. She bolted down the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. The door was still shut, the lock intact. But the box of photographs she had been sorting through was overturned, the pictures scattered across the floor. Every single photo now had the figure in it. In some, it stood in the background, its shadowy form blending into the scenery. In others, it was closer, its featureless face turned toward the camera. One photo sent a chill straight through her. It was of her, sitting in the living room just moments ago, the figure standing directly behind her. She spun around, the flashlight darting across the room. Nothing. The temperature dropped suddenly, her breath fogging in the air. The shadows on the walls stretched and writhed as if alive. "Get out," a voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right next to her ear. She screamed, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of something moving in the darkness. Too tall, too twisted to be human. She didn't wait to see more. Grabbing her coat, she ran out into the blizzard, the snow stinging her face and numbing her hands. When she looked back, the house was dark and silent, the windows like empty eyes staring after her. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her car, too terrified to return. The next morning, when the storm finally cleared, she went back to the house to retrieve her things. But the photographs were gone, along with any trace of the figure. The only thing left was the empty envelope, lying in the middle of the living room floor. She never found out who or what had been in the house that night. But sometimes when the snow falls thick and heavy, she swears she can see a tall, shadowy figure watching her from the edge of the trees.
Story number 9.
The winter sky was moonless, and the dense forest surrounding the old logging camp was eerily quiet. Eric and his friends had driven deep into the wilderness for a weekend of snowshoeing and ghost stories around the fire. They hadn't expected the storm that hit that night, burying their camp under heavy snow and cutting off all cell service. "Let's just hunker down," Eric suggested, trying to stay calm. The others agreed, bundling up in their tents and waiting for the storm to pass. But by midnight, the screaming started. At first, Eric thought it was the wind. It howled and whistled, rattling the canvas of his tent. But then he heard it again, a sharp human scream, echoing through the trees. He unzipped his tent and poked his head out. "Did you hear that?" he called to his friends. Mia and Ryan emerged from their tents, their faces pale. "What was that?" Mia asked, clutching her coat tightly around her. "Maybe it's someone lost in the storm," Ryan said. "We should check it out." Against their better judgment, they grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods, the beam of their lights barely cutting through the swirling snow. The screaming grew louder as they trudged deeper into the forest. It was high-pitched and desperate, like someone in unbearable pain. But there was something unnatural about it, a distortion that sent chills down Eric's spine. "It's coming from over there," Mia whispered, pointing toward a break in the trees. The group followed the sound until they stumbled upon an old abandoned logging cabin. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and its windows were dark and shattered. "Hello?" Eric called, stepping cautiously toward the door. "Is someone in there?" The screaming stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind. "I don't like this," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Let's go back to camp." But Eric was already opening the door. The inside of the cabin was a mess, rotting wood, broken furniture, and an overwhelming stench of decay. Snow had blown in through the broken windows, forming drifts on the floor. Then they saw the footprints. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the floor and leading to a trapdoor in the corner. The prints were strange, too large to be human and too irregular to belong to any animal Eric could think of. Ryan pointed his flashlight at the trapdoor. "Do you think someone's down there?" Before anyone could answer, the screaming started again, this time from directly beneath their feet. Mia grabbed Eric's arm. "We have to leave. Now." But Eric couldn't move. He was staring at the trapdoor, his breath fogging in the freezing air. The sound was louder now, more guttural, and it sent a wave of nausea through him. Then the trapdoor slammed open. Something shot out of the darkness so fast that none of them saw it clearly. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that bent the wrong way and a face that was little more than a pale blur. Mia screamed as it lunged toward them, its movements jerky and inhuman. Ryan swung his flashlight at it, but it passed right through the creature like smoke. "Run!" Eric shouted, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her toward the door. They barreled out of the cabin and into the storm, the thing's distorted screams chasing them through the woods. Eric didn't look back, even when he heard Ryan yell and then go silent. When they reached the camp, their tents were gone, buried under the snow or blown away, they couldn't tell. Eric and Mia didn't stop running until they reached the car. The next morning, a rescue team found Ryan's body near the cabin. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, and his footprints in the snow ended abruptly, as though he had been lifted off the ground. Eric and Mia never spoke of that night again. But every winter, when the snow begins to fall, Eric dreams of the cabin. In the dreams, he hears the screaming again, closer, louder, and he knows it's only a matter of time before the thing finds him.